So, welcome to this live session. Today, I'm joined by Julian Treasure, whose talk on how to speak so that people want to listen is the sixth most viewed TED Talks of all time, and I'm totally pleased to have you here to have an important conversation on that topic of listening. How to listen well is the title of this conversation. Um, Julian, what was the most interesting or surprising sound that you've heard today?
Today, probably my husky barking because huskies don't bark. They're very quiet dogs. But somebody's deposited some sheep in the field just over the back of our wall, which is slightly inconvenient because huskies can jump. So that was certainly a slightly alarming sound first thing this morning.
So, did it trigger an action for you? So you went straight out
Oh
there
yes,
to,
oh yeah.
yeah.
Run out and bring the dog in. Yes, definitely. Yes, we don't want dogs chasing sheep around here. The farmers don't like it.
I know that in one of your TED talks, you talk about five practices to improve your listening and paying attention to these environmental sounds, the sounds that we don't hear in a conversation, but that just happen around us, is one of the ways to improve our listening skills. Could you speak a little bit more to that and probably what you specifically did to pay attention to your dog, but how you apply that principle in your life and even business?
Well, it's very important. I mean, there are so many reasons to listen. Actually, so many of them. One is the aesthetic appeal of embracing soundscapes, of relishing, of savouring, as I call it, the sound around you. It's actually very important also to do that because it allows you to take responsibility for the sound that's around you. Now, of course, we can't control it all, but most of the time we're completely passive. That's just going on. And it's not all good for us. So there are a couple of things we can do. If we become conscious of the sound around us, which is affecting our bodies, our feelings, our thinking, and our behavior, all those four things deeply affected by the sound around us. So if you become conscious of it, you can take responsibility for it. If it's not very nice, you can switch it off if you can, or move to somewhere else. You know, very often I'm in London, I see people standing on a street bellowing at each other when somebody's drilling right next to them. And I think, why don't you move? But we don't, do we? We just think, well, that's the sound, you know. And it's not like that. Actually, we can get much more into a relationship, an active relationship with sound, as you would with taste. You know, that's why I talk about savouring. You know, you put things in your mouth, you spit them out if they don't taste good. And you're very careful about what you put in your mouth. But we don't have the same kind of curatorship for our ears, unfortunately. They get besieged with noise the whole time. So, to me, the first stage in listening better is to become conscious that listening is work, it's an action, and it's a skill, not to be confused with hearing, which is a capability. So it's a different thing. And the moment you become conscious that you're doing something, then you can, and it's a skill, you can set about mastering it or enjoying it or taking responsibility for what goes into those amazing instruments on either side of your head.
Yeah. And one thing that you mentioned, I think is worth exploring a little bit deeper because you mentioned those uncomfortable situations. And uncomfortable situations don't only happen with surroundings that kind of we just happen to be in, but they happen in relationships with both in our personal lives, but also in business. Like, for example, a tense meeting where someone's raising their voice or using inappropriate language. And what you said just um, seems to imply that there's a way for us to control our reaction to that. First of all, by paying attention to the sounds that we're actually hearing, but also to the subtone and subtleties in the language that people are using.
Yes, certainly. If you're conscious that you're doing something, I mean, listening is a two-stage process. You select certain things to pay attention to, and then you make them mean something. You interpret them. So my definition of listening is making meaning from sound, which is a very different thing to hearing. And it's partly volitional. It's partly something that you can change. You know, it's up to you how you interpret sound a lot of the time. Not all the time. Your brain is very fast at interpreting sounds. It will take a sound in. We respond far faster to sound than we do to visual input, by the way, because it's your primary warning sense. You know, we can hear what's behind us, can't see what's behind us. We can hear in the dark, can't see in the dark. So it's been a very important sense for safety, security, survival for many, many, many millennia. And as such, it goes very, very deep, very fast. There's a lot you can't control. But the moment your cortex gets involved, you can start to interpret sound in different ways. I talk about the fact we listen through filters, and you talked about emotion here. Emotion in a meeting, if somebody's shouting at you, or there's bad vibes going on, there's anger or aggression or whatever, we will have an emotional reaction to that, and emotion changes our listening. Actually, it's pretty hard to listen when you get really upset, and by the same token, if somebody's really upset, the best way to calm them down is to listen to them. Listening and emotional upset or strong emotion, I think, are kind of inversely related in those ways. So it's possible to become conscious of your response, your emotional response when you're listening to somebody, and perhaps challenge that or ask, am I listening from, I talk about listening positions. Am I listening from the best place in this conversation? And rather than getting into conflict, there's a very, very important thing that I teach these days, which wasn't in any of my TED Talks and not in my books either. It's validation. And it's, to me, the single thing that's missing most from the world as we see listening diminishing, polarization, demonization, hatred. I seem to have disappeared. That's interesting. 1 second.
We can still hear you and listen to you.
I'll keep talking, and my camera. Oh, there it is. We've come back on.
Yeah.
So polarization, demonization, all of those kind of things, which really are about not listening to people. Let me just try and come back to. Sorry about this. I'm trying to get my picture back to where, well, I'll just go with this. Technology, wonderful. Actually, technology is another big problem for listening because we're so distracted with technology, something in our hand taking our attention away the whole time. You can challenge those emotions. You can become conscious of the filters that you're listening through, of the way sound is affecting you, and then perhaps challenge it, moderate it, ameliorate it, and hopefully then validate somebody who perhaps you don't agree with. Your validation sounds like, Michael, I don't agree with what you just said, but I can see why you would believe that.
Yeah,
that's very different from, Michael, you're wrong. That's crap. Because that's just going to create conflict.
What I find interesting about that is that it seems to work both ways. That, as you mentioned, just listening more intently to what's actually being said and trying to understand what makes that person say that or say it in that way might help in calming ourselves down. But it might also help the other person to calm down, because the feeling of that we're not listening close enough to them, that they are not being heard by us, might be exactly the trigger that led them to raise their voice or feel a little bit angry about us. So there seems to be an interesting relationship here. And
Yeah, the easiest way to get somebody to listen to you is to listen to them. And you're right, it is infectious the other
exactly.
way, unfortunately, as well. You know, I called my book How to Be Heard because that's what
Mhm.
people want. My TED
Yeah.
Talk on speaking has been seen by 5 times as many people as my TED Talk on listening.
Mm.
So we are much keener to be heard than we are to listen. And that doesn't work too well, does it? I mean, what's the point of speaking brilliantly if nobody's listening? To me,
It,
listening is the foundational skill. Foundational.
yeah.
Without listening, there's no point speaking.
And the irony is that we've all made that those experiences, right? That we've been to that party where there was that outspoken person who just never got tired to telling his story to everyone who happened to cross his path, right? And everyone was just tired of hearing him speak, while the person that kind of struck a chord and that resonated with us was the one who asked the question towards us, who asked us to open up and tell us about us. So the person who listens to us is the one that we feel drawn to, and that then we might pay attention to afterwards, as you already mentioned.
So true. That sounds like a personal experience there, Michael. I'm sorry you had that one, but
Ah,
yeah, it's absolutely true. You know, there's a great phrase you can use in conversation which will really make the thing roll much better. Tell me more. Tell me more about that.
yeah.
That is such a powerful phrase to use when you're speaking or when you're listening to somebody. And the more you listen, the more somebody's ego is flattered, the more they feel cared about, heard, understood, valued, and the better the relationship will be. And they are much more likely then to start listening to you when you start to speak.
And that also opens up an interesting path for the person speaking, right? Because from that perspective, it's the same way. I mean, the usual way of speaking and of getting your message across is that, well, people seem to kind of throw everything at their audience and hope that that something sticks. And when they're done speaking, everyone is hopefully convinced, right? But that's not how it works. That's how you're almost guaranteed to have your audience tune out. A much better way to get them to actually listen to you is to encourage them to ask that question. Tell me more, right? To give them one thing that makes them curious to engage in a conversation and to ask you. So that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, there's a great question editors use when they're training journalists, and it's the one they ask over and over and over again. So what? If you're giving a talk, or even if you're speaking one to one, it's an important question to ask. Why would this matter to them? Put yourself in their shoes and say, so what?
Yeah.
Is there a consequence here? Are you taking them on a journey from place A to place B? Are you giving them a gift? You know, that's what I always train people on with public speaking, and I'm sure you do as well, is the concept of a gift. You know, if you're going to give somebody a Christmas present or a birthday present, hey, here you are, here's your present. You're happy, you're excited, you're engaged. Well, when you walk on stage and give a talk, you're giving a gift. And that is the way to present yourself. It's not about you, it's about the gift you're giving to other people. And actually, when you think about listening, there's a very, very important concept that I teach. And that is that you're listening, Michael, and everybody else is listening to this, is unique. Nobody listens like you do. And it's one of the most common mistakes that people make, as you just said, you know, walk on a stage and just, you know, give everything to the people. That's not going to work very well because you're always speaking into a listening, and that listening is unique.
Yeah.
Our listening changes over time. You know, if you're tired, upset, happy, you've just had great news, you're hungry, whatever it may be, your listening changes through the day, and it changes from person to person or group to group.
Yeah.
So it's a really
I
important question to ask. What's the listening I'm speaking into?
Yeah. Yeah, and to be totally honest, we won't ever fully know that, right? I think Miles Davis nailed that one when he said that if you understood everything I said, you'd be me, right? And so there's always that point where we think we've made it totally clear, and we made our best effort to speaking from your perspective, using your language, and still it lands on a completely different territory. They understood it in a completely different way, and there's no way that we could have anticipated it, because these people just have made very different experiences than we have. And so even if we have a totally clear understanding, and I use kind of the word apple, you will see something very different, and will mean something very different to you than it means to me.
Yeah, semantics are so important. There's the meaning of the word, and then there's all the stuff around it. There was a TV campaign in the UK some years ago by a phone manufacturer, which was "Be more dog." They didn't mean go down on all fours. They meant be more cheerful, loyal, friendly, tail waggy, that kind of thing. We all know what that's imputation. It's not actually what a dog is. So you're absolutely right. And particularly, of course, across language or culture, then the semantics can be very, very different. And it's important to check in. If you're speaking into a listening, or you're listening to somebody, let's check in. So, Michael, what I understood you to say is this. Did I get that right? Because then we can move on with the conversation. You got the ball over the net. I know what you said. Okay, we're on. And you know that I know as well.
Yeah, and that's a pity that so much time is spent in kind of meetings, for example, in marketing departments, who craft those great sounding, fancy sounding messages without ever bothering to ask someone, so what do you take this to mean? How would you repeat that in your own words? And so we spend so much time and money to craft brilliant pieces of art that don't convey the meaning that we thought it would.
Well, there was a car launched in the UK many years ago called the Nova, which they then launched in Spain. In Spain, Nova means it doesn't go. That wasn't a great success. So, yeah, semantics, very important.
Yeah. Which actually means that from a business perspective, so we really need to validate what people hear from us when we speak to them, so that we need to get better at listening to understand how our audience listens to the messages that we send.
Indeed.
Any tips from your side on how we could do that, and how to validate the messages and tap into kind of the intelligence of our audiences?
Well, the first thing is to ask that question, what's the listening? And, it's kind of a black box. I always say to people, look, I can't tell you why it works, but if you get into the habit of asking that question, whenever you're speaking to one person, 1,000 people, it doesn't matter, what's the listening? You will become more and more sensitive to it. I don't know if it's facial expressions, micro expressions, body language, pheromones, whatever it might be, psychic powers. But I can tell you that it works. If you're asking that question, you sensitize yourself to the other person, and you can then adapt your content and your delivery to match them. Some of it's obvious. If you're talking to somebody who's very slow and ponderous in their speak, and you're speaking like this, it doesn't work. You overwhelm them. You intimidate them enormously. So just things like pace, pitch, vocabulary as well. I will often change my vocabulary based on the audience I'm speaking to make it easier for them to understand. When I've spoken to foreign language audiences, they're having to translate in their heads my English. So I slow down and I don't use jargon or complicated words. Speaking into a listening. It's something which I think is so powerful, and yet many people just ignore it altogether. They don't think about how the message is going to be received. What are the semantics?
I'm actually a big believer in the blank stare, right? So when you explain something to someone and they respond with a blank stare, it often it often kind of tends to frustrate people. But I always kind of see that more as a gift, because it's a very clear signal that what I just said wasn't the best way to articulate it. And so it's a clear trigger for me to look for better words. And once we start paying attention to that, and consider that as a tool and something to work with, we open our senses up for more subtle signals that might not be as obvious as someone leaving the room angry or pulling up their phone and tune out. But the more subtle raise of their eyebrows or looking sideways, stuff that informs us that we need to improve the way that we're speaking.
That's true. But let's go on to the other side of the fence. And a tool I teach for listening in conversation, which is very powerful, is RASA. That stands for receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. And so if you're listening to somebody speaking, receive means pay attention, eye contact. You know, the dance of the eyes. If I'm speaking to you, I'll look around the room perhaps as I'm thinking, and I'll come back from time to time to check you're still there and still paying attention. But if I'm listening to you, I look at you. Yeah. So receive is to look at the person, and body language wise, you know, you can show you're interested by leaning slightly forward. So your feet aren't pointing for the door. You're not playing with other things. You're not picking your phone up and doing your email or whatever. So receive. Appreciate is the little things that we can do to oil the conversation. So little noises. Oh, really? Eyebrow raises, smiles, bobs of the head, all those things that show that we're actually engaged, as opposed to the blank stare that you just mentioned. So that's appreciate. Summarize, the word so, very important. That is the validation piece where, so Michael, I understood you say this, is that right? So we're closing doors in the long corridor of a conversation, and I'm confirming that I received. And then the A is ask. Questions, why, what, which, when, where, who, the open-ended questions, or that lovely phrase, tell me more, which allows you to tease things out, clarify things, and again, show that you're paying attention and that you're engaged. So RASA, it's a beautiful way to listen, and people have said amazing things to me about that tool. A man once told me it saved his marriage. So RASA is very powerful.
It is, and it is a little bit sad to hear stories of kind of teams where people shy away from asking those questions that for clarification, because they feel it makes them sound not knowledgeable or not on top of things, or that they should know things. And so rather than ask for clarification, they just remain silent. And that not only means that they steal the speaker from a learning opportunity, it also means that probably others feel the same, right? And if no one's finding the courage to speak up and raise that question, it means that we turn unclear communication into a habit and make it okay to settle for that.
That's very true. There was a big piece of work done a few years ago called the Organizational Listening Project, which found that organizations, by and large, are abject at listening. They put 4 times as much energy and effort into sending as they do into receiving, particularly internally. There are very few organizations which, for example, assess people on listening skills. They all say it's important when they recruit people, and then they forget about it. So, does the 360-degree appraisal have the question, is this person good at listening? How good is this person at listening? No. Does anybody ever get paid more for listening well? Nope. So it's kind of a hidden skill that, it frustrates me enormously. We don't teach it in school. If we taught school children how to listen first, how much more of their education would they receive in all those years they're spending with teachers shouting at them in noisy classrooms and so forth? It is, unfortunately, it's a hidden skill, as I say, and it's dying a death at the moment in the world as more and more people shout at each other. And, many organizations are like the one you just mentioned, where it's seen as a weakness to ask a question or to not understand something. I mean, that's a terrible way to be. Creating a listening organization has huge bottom line impact because that piece of research I just mentioned showed that the better listening organizations had better staff retention, better customer retention, better productivity, better morale, and so on and so on and so on. So it pays on the bottom line to become a listening organization, but it's not simple.
Yeah. And one thing that you just mentioned about that, the noise and that's kind of making things worse, made me think of an interesting relationship here towards the opposite of noise, which is silent, which happens to be an anagram of listen, right? In order to listen well, you need to be silent. And in a world that cannot tolerate or even stand a moment of silence, which feels like every moment of silence needs to be filled, means that it's harder to listen well in that world, because we are constantly kind of distracted with the next noise that's interrupting, but also from the speaking perspective, we're stripping our conversation partner from opening up more when we just grant them that additional second of silence to collect their thoughts and find a different way of explaining what they're actually feeling.
So true. Yeah, I teach silence as a practice. I always recommend people get silence a couple of times a day to recalibrate the ears. And in fact, my new book, which comes out next year, Sound Effects, which is all about the relationship between human beings and sound, the whole last chapter is about silence, because that's the baseline. Without silence, nothing makes sense. It's all just cacophony. It's the gaps between the words, the gaps between the notes that make everything make sense. So, silence is very important. And more than half the world live in cities now, which makes me very sad because there are a lot of people who never encounter biophilic sound, natural sound, and never encounter silence. And that is a tragedy, I think.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And looking at the clock, I see that we're already approaching the half-hour mark. So it might be a good opportunity to give the viewers of this conversation a moment of silence and to digest what we just spoke about. Thank you, Julian, for joining me here. I encourage everyone viewing this conversation to connect with Julian and also with myself to check out his new book that's coming out next year. But other than that, I think we all can make use much more of silence and kind of enjoy a moment to reflect on what we just discussed, but also in general in a conversation to just stay silent a little bit more, to give others the space to open up more. Thanks, Julian, for joining me here.
Thank you, Michael.